When you were in grade school, you learned about natural resources and that water is a renewable resource. Precipitation falls to the earth, collects in rivers and streams, evaporates, and the cycle repeats. However, despite being renewable, there is a finite amount of water on the earth, and it gets recycled again and again. All of this water is part of a watershed, and no matter where you're standing on the earth, you are in a watershed.
Watershed, on its simplest terms, is when we get precipitation, whether that be rain or snow, that's going to fall within a geographic boundary. And as the rain starts to fall, one of these raindrops will eventually hit a boundary where it, at one point on one side of the boundary, it will flow one way, on another part it will flow a different way. And that area where it all coalesces to a specific point is considered a watershed area.
Locally, ours is the Niagara River Lake Erie watershed. This includes all of Erie County and parts of Niagara, Orleans, Genesee, Wyoming, Cattaraugus, all the way down to Chautauqua County and a small piece of Allegheny County. All of the water that lands on a surface in the Niagara River Lake Erie watershed will eventually end up in Lake Erie and/or the Niagara River. The Niagara River Lake Erie watershed also contains 18 subwatersheds. Subwatersheds all drain into more localized bodies of water that eventually drain to Lake Erie. So, for example, the 18-Mile Creek is a subwatershed that drains 120 square miles of land and 274 miles of waterways. It includes parts of the towns of Hamburg, Eden, Evans, North Collins, Orchard Park, Boston, Colden, and Concord. The Niagara River Lake Erie watershed is part of a larger watershed, the Great Lakes watershed, or the Great Lakes Basin. The Great Lakes Basin drains water from 8 states and 1 Canadian province. The upstream portions of a watershed are called the headwaters. It's at that point that if water falls on one side of that border, it'll end up in one body of water. If it falls on the other side, it'll end up in another. One example of this is the Lodge Forest, located in Chautauqua County. Aside from its old-growth forest and the extensive biodiversity, it's interesting because it sits on a continental divide. So if rain falls on one side of the property, it drains to Lake Erie and the Atlantic Ocean. On the other side, it drains to the Allegheny River, the Mississippi River, and to the Gulf of Mexico. Headwater streams come together to form larger streams and rivers that flow downhill and downstream, eventually draining into a single body of water, which is what makes them all part of the same watershed. Whether rain falls from the sky and lands on a farm in Wyoming County, or snow melts on a street in Buffalo and runs down a storm drain, that runoff all makes its way to a larger body of water, in our case, Lake Erie. As it flows over a surface, it picks up whatever is on that particular surface. Oil on the street from a car, dog poop, road salt, particles of soil containing phosphorus or nitrogen from fertilizer, or chemicals from pesticides. It's a simple mathematic equation. Your water is the sum of everything within your watershed that the water flows over and distributes there. Under the Clean Water Act, stormwater is water in urbanized areas that flows over surfaces picking up pollutants that end up in our water resources. It is often monitored under a stormwater management program. The Clean Water Act also regulates runoff from large farms called Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations, or CAFOs. In unregulated areas, non-point source pollution that flows over a surface isn't regulated because there are too many variables and it is difficult to monitor. Both stormwater and non-point source pollution are major contributing factors to poor water quality, with storms and floods largely increasing the amount of pollutants entering waterways. On the contrary, point source pollution comes from an identifiable source, such as a factory, large farm, construction site, or wastewater treatment plant. It requires a state pollution discharge elimination permit, commonly referred to as a SPDIES permit. This requires monitoring and limiting the type and amount of pollutants discharged. Many of these pollutants in our watershed eventually end up in Lake Erie. Lake Erie, as well as some lakes, rivers, and streams, serve as intakes for our drinking water. The more contaminants that get into the water, the more difficult and expensive it is to treat. It's also important to mention that actions taken upstream have effects downstream. This could be anything from land use, an open field, farm, apartment complex, developed town center, to how we maintain our rivers and streams. Are they meandering with adequate floodplain, or have they been straightened with hardened sides, with stone or concrete walls? Maybe some sort of combination. Regardless, this all affects what enters our water and how it behaves downstream. The good news is that there are opportunities to use a more strategic approach when it comes to land use planning and managing our natural resources that result in cleaner water and less effort to treat the water. We'll look at some of the major issues, such as flooding and erosion, urban and agricultural runoff, and examples of projects including a stream bank stabilization project and culvert replacement. Flooding is a common issue across most of our subwatersheds. Some of it is due to development and increased paved, impervious surfaces where water is no longer absorbed, compounded with increased precipitation in the region. In others, it's from erosion causing log jams or from ice jams forming.
With climate change, steep slopes that we have larger rain events, and erosion becomes a huge issue with sediment in the streams and infrastructure damage. You saw on Vermont Hill Road that some of the road was washed out there just from the moderate rain. So with the steep slopes in the town, it gets amplified quite a bit. So controlling that has been an issue that we've been working on in town.
The sheer volume of water that goes through the 18-mile creek has eroded. I can't begin to fathom how many yards of earth and soil and stone when there's been large heavy snow melt. I've watched the creek swell toward the point where it's touching the bottom of the bridges that are throughout the municipality. Logs that anyone that was in the timber industry would you can watch trees float by, boulders. I mean it's destructive, and it's a force of nature, and so these are all the things that, again, it's the information. These are all the little data sets that we need to put the pieces of the puzzle together to allow us to strategize and how do we fix this.
With existing patterns of development and the adverse impacts these patterns have had on the quality and health of the watershed, the Niagara River Habitat Conservation Strategy shows that the greatest opportunities to properly maintain the watershed lay where large tracts of intact landscapes remain undisturbed. In simplest terms, the best way to prevent additional or worsening future issues is to protect the best of what remains. For areas that have already been developed and are experiencing issues as a result, there may be some partial solutions to help mitigate the issue. One solution in areas with more space is reconnecting a stream to its floodplain. Floodplains are areas adjacent to rivers or streams that flood and help absorb water during high flow or flood events. It also helps slow the velocity of the river, lessening more extreme erosion or flash flooding. For example, this is a soccer field in the town of Holland that is connected to Cazenovia Creek. It floods in the spring, helping to lessen flooding in residential areas. In flooding-prone areas, more and more towns are looking at reconnecting park space or open space to rivers and streams to lessen instances of flooding in residential areas and in town centers. This is one of the reasons that land conservation and park space are so valuable. Whether it's forested land, farmland, wetlands, not only do they provide respite for people and habitat for animals, they absorb, store, and filter water, providing huge ecological and economic benefits to our watershed. When towns are developed with a significant amount of impervious surface, one potential solution is implementing green infrastructure. Green infrastructure captures and treats stormwater, reducing flows to sewer systems and surface water, potentially reducing flooding.
At the northern edge of the mill plaza, there's a 28-foot escarpment edge. Now, traditionally, all the stormwater that we're talking about would just collect and kind of run over that escarpment edge. It would silt in ponds at Glen Park. It would make its way directly into Ellicott Creek. And now what happens is the water makes its way through this filter system coming down Spring Street and across the mill plaza and works its way into a bioswale at the top of that escarpment. The bioswale's deep. It's got a lot of plant material, a lot of vegetation. They really like the depth that their roots can get into. And then the water cascades through a tiered green wall system before it's finally released into Glen Park below. Of course, it's released slower, but it's also released clean. At that point, we've taken the majority of pollutants and toxins out of the water. We've slowed the erosion process or the silting over process down in Glen Park because we're not dumping content and debris and material into our ponds. But we're also releasing good, clean, safe water into Ellicott Creek, and that's what the village was really after when we did this project.
Another solution often used in the face of flooding is increasing the size of culverts. They can be placed under roads to prevent debris from accumulating or the road from washing out.
A project we've been working on with the Soil and Water District of Erie County to replace some of there was three culverts in through here, so we replaced those three culverts. They need to be replaced with a large squat culvert that allows for fish and wildlife to go upstream without being inhibited by the culverts. So this is the Buffalo Creek that feeds into the Buffalo River eventually. The town doesn't have a lot to work with. They've been running on a tight budget, so working with the other institutions like the Soil and Water Conservation and LUPA and Erie County Water Quality Committee allows us to get some grant money to do these projects properly and keep some of the issues from becoming an issue in the future. Controlling erosion, doing the ditches correctly is one example.
Both in Boston and Holland, they emphasized gathering more data to better understand the hydrology of their respective watersheds, as well as where the majority of issues are occurring. In Boston, Supervisor Keating has been working on a drainage improvement plan with their town engineer.
You know, the 100-year floodplains that were there, and let's face it, the maps that are out there, they're from the, from Army Corps of Engineers, nothing against them, but the reality is these maps are from the 70s or the 80s. They have not been updated in decades. In today's world, today's climate, call it what you want, climate change, global warming, whatever people want, whatever adjective or descriptive term they want to give to it. The reality is that these floods and the rains are not what they were just even 10 years ago. So if we don't, the example I use and I bring to the table, look at our look at our country down south. The flooding, they're investing in their infrastructure, they're investing in how to handle water. That's exactly what we need to do here. We've had many years that we have not had to do this in the, I'll call it the Northeast, but I think it's, time is of the essence. If we don't start taking care of things now, yes, people's basements will continue to flood, we'll continue to have washouts, we'll continue to have erosion, all these other problems, and ultimately that does fall on government, whether it's local government, county government, or state for that matter. So, and infrastructure is going to be a big topic of discussion. That's my prediction for quite some time to come.
In addition to reconnecting rivers and streams to floodplain and installing or retrofitting culverts, another tool commonly used to address flooding or erosion is stream bank restoration.
So essentially this is a stream bank stabilization that we partnered with the town of Colden and a private landowner, Mr. Solly, with the Soil and Water Conservation District, and it's really the third in a three-phase project. There was additional projects that were completed downstream by both the town and the Soil and Water District and also the school district. And this one really is essentially what we refer to as longitudinal peaked stone toe protection. There's a number of stream barbs or rock veins that are also included in the project. And currently what the guys are doing right now is to add some riparian vegetation to the project. So as you can see, water is up, so you can't really see a lot of the project. But the hope is to mitigate the erosion, reduce the sediment load to the stream, increase the vegetative cover and canopy. And this section in particular also has ice jam flooding, and it's prone to collecting debris from upstream, large tree debris, which exacerbates any flooding. So by keeping a nice smooth transition, smooth alignment, our hope is that we will mitigate some of the localized flooding that occurs, as well as improving water quality.
Because of the steep banks that require regrading, this was a larger restoration project. But for less extreme situations, planting riparian vegetation along the edge of the stream, or live staking with fast-growing, water-resistant trees, helps develop more of a root structure that better holds soil in place, hopefully reducing erosion. The trees also provide shade to the river, which helps keep temperatures down and provides better habitat for fish and animal species. Small changes, such as leaving a buffer on the land before the edge of the water, or by not mowing grass past a certain point, leaving a vegetated strip, or by not planting crops the whole way up to the edge of the river, also makes a big difference and helps reduce sediment and nutrients from entering the water. These are examples of best management practices, or managing your land to help mitigate pollution from entering waterways. Soil and water conservation districts are often working with farmers, private landowners, and municipalities on how to apply these best management practices.
As you get up on top of the ridge, there's some flat areas, and we have a lot of dairy farms and cow areas, and the streams will dissect those fields and then into the deep ravines, and or controlling the nitrates and other phosphates and stuff that go into Castle Creek is a big issue. So again, it's something that I think LUPA and other organizations have been studying, so I'd like to gain information on that and see if we can come up with some innovative ways of controlling that.
One potential solution is agricultural environmental management through New York State Agriculture and Markets. AEM links farmers with local conservation professionals, such as your Soil and Water Conservation District, to address natural resource concerns and enhance farm viability. This could include an environmental assessment, a farm plan, best management practice design and implementation, or updates to existing practices. These solutions are tailored to the specific farm and could include a range of things, such as manure and waste treatment systems, soil conservation through crop rotation or cover crops, or riparian buffer systems.
We have multiple different farm types. We have vegetable, we have dairy, we have small, large farms. All of these contribute to watershed runoff and potential pollution of our 18-mile creek. And so I know that we work very closely with the state, the federal government, our farmers do, I should say, to make sure that any kind of potential pollution or from their runoff water is being taken care of, or at least addressed in a way to keep the 18-mile creek clean, which obviously is goes to the mouth of Lake Erie.
It's no secret that our Watersheds farms have some of the best soil in the country, and that farmers are the stewards of our land and our water resources. They provide fresh food, but they also help to capture and filter water and provide habitat. One of the threats to this, as people move out of cities and look for places to build, is development, particularly housing developments in town centers.
The prime soils in Holland, they're all important soils. A lot of the soils are classified as important soils for their farming, and a lot of dairy lands up on the hills, but the prime soil for agriculture is in the valley along Route 16, which unfortunately is also the prime area for new development. They're putting a new plaza in where some of our prime soils are. Trying to balance landowners' wants and needs to what's best for the town is a challenge for the planning board and town board.
However, there are various tools that can be used to protect agricultural land, as well as forests and open space, whether that be through zoning, comprehensive plans, or conservation easements.
We do have some of the most protected soils. We do have prime soil. Some of the best soils in the United States reside in the town of Eden, and those are well protected as well through ordinances, as well as agricultural districting and agricultural zoning.
Yeah, and also doing some agricultural zoning implementation as far as maybe some incentives for the farmers to keep it as working with the Land Conservancy and such, and encouraging that.
So obviously we have zoned agricultural land in our town. Some of the things that we're doing right now with the implementation of our last comprehensive plan, which was done in 2018, is we have just recently applied for a agricultural grant funded through the county that would allow us to expand our agricultural zoning use as well as our suburban use, and that should open up some more opportunities for farming within our community.
A common misconception is that developed land is more beneficial to a town because of its tax revenue. However, nearly all cost of community service studies, which examine tax revenues generated by different land uses and the costs to local government providing services to those uses, show that residential land is a net drain on local governments. Farm and forested land require fewer community services and help towns maintain lower property taxes. Whatever the case, when looking for solutions, there isn't a one-size-fits-all option. Depending on the size or source of the issue, some solutions may be larger in scale or more costly than others. Thank you for attending What is a Watershed 101. We hope that you came away with a better understanding of what a watershed is and how your community's actions impact our water resources. As you reflect on the presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the organizations listed if you have any questions about the presentation, issues, or ideas for future projects.